Welcome everybody to our policy forum on the dangers of socialism. At the LIBRE Institute, we're really proud to provide a platform where Latinos across the country and frankly, all Americans can join in, where we can have an honest conversation about the issues that are impacting Latinos across the country. What is sound policy and sometimes what is bad policy, the kind of policies that we need to resist. And in this case, when we talk about socialism, this is a pernicious idea that seems to rear its ugly head often. And so for some time now, we have seen almost a normalizing of socialism and socialist type ideas and policies, the kind that centralizes more power, more control, and more money in the hands of a central government, in this case, Washington, D.C. It sprung from our universities, where many professors who frankly didn't care for jobs in the private sector took to teaching their high-minded socialist ideas to our students. All fantasy land ideas that have never worked the way they have theorized. Socialists with their socialism for many years now decades, have promised heaven everywhere they have implemented their programs, but have only delivered hell. To be specific, scarcity, hunger, oppression of rights, and equality of misery. But what has been breathtaking is how popular and how wide these ideas have been spreading to America at large, and which is what compels us to have this kind of discussion with experts, folks who have personally experienced the ravages of socialism in their countries and have seen it take a hold of really private property, freedom of expression, usurp the role of family, church, and the free market. We see even here in America now protests and marches with pro-socialism signs. And we see it all over social media. Young Americans who have benefited from the wealth generated by our free market system have passionately almost embraced these failed and dangerous ideas. Why are they pernicious? And why should we move quickly to promote ideas that are far superior? These are some of the questions we should ask, and we will. And we aim to hold an honest and sober conversation about the massive failures of socialism and socialist type ideas in exactly this hour and a half. So we're very happy that you'll join us. I'm going to be introducing our panelists one at a time, and they'll talk about their own personal experience in their own country and how socialism ravaged their country. And so after that, we're going to go to a sort of a question and answer period. So if you're joining us by Facebook or some media platform, we're monitoring, and we love to have your questions so that we can also prompt our panelists in answering some of these questions. So we're thrilled that you could also participate and that this be interactive. So let's get started. The first panelist that I want to introduce is Ambassador Otto Reich. Really, it's an honor to have the ambassador with us. He has spent most of his life in foreign affairs, primarily related to Latin America and the Caribbean, including private enterprise and government and the U.S. military. He has an extensive resume, to say the least. But let me highlight that in 2001, President George W. Bush selected Ambassador Reich to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, reporting to the Secretary of State, then Colin Powell, where he served until 2002. He also served as U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela, for which he was awarded the highest commendations of both the State Department and the Republic of Venezuela. So, Ambassador, please, I want to ask you, what was your personal experience with socialism and how it puts America in a perilous situation?
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. And I want to thank the LIBRE Institute for inviting me to this important discussion. The way that I first came into knowledge of socialism, I was born in Cuba, but it wasn't really because of my Cuban experience that came with socialism. That came later. My father was an Austrian refugee. He had fled the Nazis in 1938 and managed to escape by crossing the Alps into France and then joining the French Foreign Legion. When the French surrendered, he managed to get on a Portuguese freighter and ended up in Havana, Cuba. A lot of people associate socialism incorrectly only with extreme left policies. The fact is that the regime that my father left and that killed all of his family was a socialist regime, the National Socialist Party of Germany, and which later, of course, annexed Austria and invaded many other countries in Europe and caused the deaths of, it's estimated, 44 million people in the war. So let's not forget that socialism is both national and international. One of the first enemies of National Socialism in Germany was the Soviet Union, which represented international socialism. The movement that the Communist Party had for the spreading of its ideology was the Communist International. Then later, of course, I found out from my father what it was like to live under the Nazis and why he escaped. And we were living in Cuba and under a dictatorship for half my life until Fidel Castro came in and said that he was going to liberate Cuba and impose or allow democracy to return. He said he was not a communist. He said it over and over again. But as soon as he seized power, he began to consolidate that power, eliminating all freedoms, personal liberties, civil liberties. And before the end of the third year in power, he controlled everything. And he then said he was a Marxist-Leninist and had always been a Marxist-Leninist. I think that during this discussion, we should explore how something like this can happen, how a democracy, whether it's in Europe or Latin America or North America, can fall prey to an ideology, which is an ideology of hatred, frankly, and of failure. My favorite definition of socialism comes from one of my personal heroes, one of my father's heroes, Winston Churchill. And I'll finish my little introduction with this, which I hope will be an introduction to our discussion. Churchill, who I believe saved the Western world almost, by virtue of his leadership in the face of the Nazi onslaught, said, "Socialism is a philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery, not just failure, but dangerous." Why does it fail? Now here's where I say, why does socialism fail? Because it cannot provide the basic human needs of the people. The people begin to rebel. The more they rebel, the more the party in power represses the people. There's a vicious circle which ends up destroying the economy of the country. And the result is countries like Venezuela, like Cuba, like what Nicaragua we're seeing in Nicaragua, and many others in the rest of the world. So let me just stop there and allow my colleagues to continue.
Thank you, Ambassador Reich. You're absolutely right. And in the book, The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich von Hayek spells out that vicious circle, right, of those who are dissidents and how they're oppressed once central planners take over a government, right? And then, of course, here comes the oppression and more socialism and more heavy-handedness. And that's the road to serfdom, yeah, that we always see. Next, I want to introduce Kitty Monterrey. I love her last name. My parents are from Monterrey, Nuevo León. So she is the national president of the party Citizens for Liberty in Nicaragua. She is dedicated to ensuring all nations are aware of the struggle against socialism of the 21st century, as well as dedicating all her efforts to the liberal cause for freedom and democracy. And I think that's a very noble cause. So Kitty, please detail for us a little bit of your personal story in experiencing the ravages of socialism, and again, what that's going to mean to the U.S.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to the LIBRE Institute for allowing me to be a part of this panel, and thank you all for listening to us, watching us this evening. I'm a dual national. I was born in the United States, and I'm also a Nicaraguan citizen. But I've spent my life in both countries, back and forth over the years, married, 3 children, 3 grandchildren, my parents, everyone lives in the United States, and my husband and I are here in Nicaragua. Difficult situation here. I know what democracy is. I know what socialism is. I'm going to go back in the 70s when I was here in Nicaragua under a military dictatorship, similar to what happened in Cuba with Fidel Castro. We had Somoza, and we thought nothing could be worse. And most of the country supported the guerrilla movement at the time to overthrow Somoza. And we thought that finally we'd have peace and democracy, and we were wrong. The results of the Civil War did not bring democracy. It resulted in a Marxist government, which immediately took away all of our freedoms. And then in the 10 years that followed, Nicaragua became the 2nd poorest country in America. And there was no such thing as human rights. Food was rationed, private property was confiscated, thousands fled the country into exile. And our family returned, we went back to the United States because simply Nicaragua was no longer a safe place to be for us, for our children. But all this led to the Contra Revolution, which was another civil war with a death toll of more than 50,000. And then finally in 1990, the Sandinistas were forced to allow free and fair elections, and they lost. And so we returned to Nicaragua. And then I was part of a team that founded the first private bank after over a decade of Sandinista rule. And a few years later, I directed a technology project that was financed by World Bank to modernize government, specifically in public finances. And Nicaragua seemed to be going in the right direction. And then in 2006, once again, Daniel Ortega, the same Marxist socialist, became president. But then I knew that I couldn't take the easy way out. It's always been simple for me to say, I have the United States to fall back on. But I thought this is the time that we have to remain in Nicaragua and do everything possible to fight for democracy, for family values, for freedom of choice. So I became a member and executive director of a political party of opposition, a party that in 2016 was revoked by the Sandinista regime, precisely the year in which Ortega, by reforming the constitution and through a fraudulent election, re-elected himself as president. So with the support of thousands of our community leaders, we decided to found a new party, Citizens for Liberty, and I was honored to be elected its national president. And today we're the only legitimate party of opposition to Ortega and his plans, not only to remain indefinitely in power, but also to expand what is known as 21st century socialism in Latin America. So the civic rebellion of 2018 has shown people all over the world what socialism has done to Nicaragua, to its people. We have no rights here. We risk imprisonment on a daily basis. I've been entrusted with the responsibility of leading our party against the Ortega regime and in speaking out on behalf of the Nicaraguan community, hoping that our voices will be heard, not only seeking support to find our path back to democracy, but also hoping that other nations will learn from our mistakes and never allow socialism to be an option ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Kitty. I already have so many questions that we're going to have to get back to, and I promise we will. But our third panelist, before we get into the questions and answers, is Andres Guilarte. He is a political activist for the freedom of Venezuela. Only a few years ago, he was a university student studying international relations at the Central University of Venezuela. On top of exams and typical college student concerns, Andres' studies were interrupted by tear gas as government officials targeted students on campus. He spent his college years advocating for his fellow students and fighting back against the rise of tyranny and the erosion of freedoms. In early 2019, he left Venezuela to intern with the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., and today he is touring the United States on behalf of the Fund for American Studies, sharing his story with collegiate audiences. Andres, I'd love for you to share some of that story with us at this moment.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Well, first of all, Thank you for the LIBRE Institute. Again, I have done some events with you guys, and it's awesome the work that you do, and especially in Florida. And well, it's an honor to be in the same panel with Ambassador Otto. And
Yes.
I mean, it's a great opportunity, not only for me, especially to learn about what they're going to say, but also for all the audience to learn more about the experience of our countries. So first of all, well, like you said, my name is Guilarte. I'm 26-year-old Venezuelan. I only have 1.5 years living here in the US. You know, there is something particular. When I was in Venezuela, especially in high school, I didn't care at all about politics. Actually, I wanted to study medicine. So I didn't enter the medicine school. So I took a whole year to study more English. And in that year, many things happened that actually led me to be involved in politics. And I got into the international studies school. While I was studying that, I took a shift and that's something that I relate a lot with my work with the Fund for American Studies, where I go to travel to college campuses. Well, tomorrow I'm going to a high school here in New York to speak with young students about what actually is socialism. And I remember myself because when I was in high school, I actually believed in socialism because that was the norm in Venezuela for everyone. I mean, there was no room for you to actually care about our opinions. And especially when I was living in Petare, which was a huge district in Venezuela, I didn't care about politics. And, I was thinking that maybe this guy Chavez was doing the right thing. As soon as I put a step in college and I started seeing other perspectives, speaking with other people, I realized how wrong I was. So that's how it's so important to go to college campuses, what we are doing with the Fund for American Studies, to engage in that respectful debate with college students and tell them that, hey, all these things that socialism is promising you, equality among all human beings, and what actually socialism wants, that is control the means of production, that being rich is bad, and all of this stuff, that there is some evil that is actually what they want that is stopping you to be successful. These are all lies. What we've seen in Venezuela is the actual success of socialism. A lot of people say the failure of socialism, but I like to say it's the success. Because when you see what actually socialism wants, is what you saw in the 2012 election in Venezuela when Hugo Chavez was doing his campaign before he died. There was a slogan he was saying. Everywhere he went, he was saying, you are no longer Maria, you're no longer Juan, you are now Chavez. So he was spreading all that ideology. And a lot of people were eager, He was like, hey, yeah, we're all Chavez, and Chavez is the people. Well, the underlying problem right there is that they were losing their identity. That's what socialism wants in the end. They want to completely destroy the power you have on your own, the power to make decisions, and you have what you have right now in Venezuela. Well, my whole family is living right there, and they know what is the struggle. I knew it because I was only 1.5 years over there. The trip of going to college, it was like 1 hour trip. You usually saw in the restaurants lines of people, but they were not in the front door. They were in the back door because they knew the schedules of the restaurants. So they wanted to be the first in line, to eat garbage. And you can see all kinds of people. There's small children, old people, and many of them, they were middle class not too many years ago, and they're finding themselves in a position where they have no choices anymore. They cannot, go to a supermarket freely like here in the US and buy whatever you want. They have to require to use this kind of stuff. When I was in the college, it was usual that every single day I have a really small amount of money. So what was my choice? Do I buy a book or do I eat? Usually the decision was to get the book because, well, the priority was to get the college degree. But that's something that students don't understand here in the US. What's the actual struggle of trying to be successful in your life in a country where socialism is the norm? So, well, we can get more into that later. So, to how that country that used to be so prosperous like Venezuela, well, ambassador was there when Venezuela was like known as the Saudi Venezuela, when it was the biggest and most prosperous country in Latin America. What happened that allowed Chavez to get to power? That's part of the presentation that I tell to college students. Do not compare the US to the Venezuela of today. Compare to the US to Venezuela in the 90s and in the 80s, and let's see how that ends up.
No, thank you, Andres. That's really compelling stuff. And let me start by asking you a question and dig down a little bit deeper. You talked about the importance of individualism, especially here in we call it American individualism, right? Where each individual has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That the politicians don't choose, the kind of dreams that you want to achieve. You choose that. Why is it so important to be an individual in a society?
Well, it's really important because when and I think that I had to relate it to the first time that I came to the US in January of last year. I went to the supermarket. It was a huge supermarket, and I saw all kinds of brands of whatever you can imagine. And there was someone walking right beside me, and that person was actually arguing with someone else and saying, why do we need all this stuff? Why do we need all these kind of brands? Actually, the Americans, it's because of all this materialism. We're losing like the spirituality between us and whatever, the universe, because we only care about having a lot of stuff in the supermarket. And all I was just thinking is, if you were in Venezuela in a supermarket where you have nothing at all, you wouldn't think about that. And I think that's something that is happening here in the US. It's known as the ones that are born in liberty, because they don't know what it is to not live without liberty. They don't know what is that. And we don't want that to happen. Because the opposite is that even if here in the US you have a lot of problems, you have problems with healthcare, you have problems with immigration, you have problems in criminal justice. Yes, you have a lot of problems, but you still can make a lot of choices. You can even go to another country if you want. That's not the norm in Venezuela. In Venezuela, you end up in a situation where you can't leave a country freely because the prices of passport is like almost $3,000 for someone that earns $1 per month. So tell me how someone is going to leave the country under those circumstances. You can't afford to just go whatever university you want. You can't afford to buy whatever you want, and you become totally dependent on someone else. And when I say someone else, I mean whoever has the power, whoever is in the government. So that's the main issue right here, that if Americans actually want to continue being American, continue being human beings, because that's not only the American dream, that's the human dream, to be yourself, whatever you want to be. If they want to continue in that situation, actually have a nation, they had to remain power within themselves. The Constitution of America was actually crystal clear. The powers of the federal government are short, and really limited, and the rest of the power goes to the people. So I think that's the main problem here in the US. A lot of people, because they were born under liberty, they think that all the problems, well, they have to be solved with the opposite, with socialism. And well, that's not the actual goal.
Yeah, Kitty, Andres talks about what he saw and what he has observed in Venezuela, and how the citizens began to cede their rights away. And how, of course, government began to take over the individualism and have people conform through coercion, right? And they lost, I think, their individuality, and of course, brought on scarcity and all these things. Somebody here in America would tell you, but you know what, man, that's not really socialism. It was implemented wrong. I'm not talking about that socialism. I bet you heard that in Nicaragua as well. What would you say to somebody who says, but that's not really the socialism I'm talking about?
It's totally different what really happens in Latin America, in different countries, on the issue of socialism. I'd like to explain, for example, what years of indoctrination by this Sandinista regime has done to our youth. I mean, it has taken away all the choices. And that's the whole issue, that they grow up in a generation believing that what they have seen and what they have been taught is right. And that is the danger to the United States. And I think, in a way, what the LIBRE Institute is doing is helping. And that's perhaps where our generation has failed in Latin America. We haven't been able to teach our children and grandchildren about the dangers of socialism, because they've taken everything for granted when they go to the United States. They get used to being in a land of opportunities, to having everything. And they don't remember, and their parents and grandparents don't explain what it is to live in a country like Venezuela, like Cuba, like Nicaragua. And it's a shame. I really think that we have to make, more effort has to be put into teaching, to reminding this generation that the United States is just as much at risk as the rest of the world, and that Latin America is suffering quite a lot, and not only in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. We're seeing how socialism is advancing in other countries as well. So to me, this is part of a regional strategy. And the United States is probably the most important country in the world for socialism to take place. And that's what they're going to try to do. So we have to make all our children and grandchildren aware of those dangers.
I couldn't agree with you more. Ambassador, I want to bring you in on this. We talk about how government begins to grow, government begins to centralize more power and more control over the people, over the individuals. And as we know that as the power and the control of government grows, there is a proportionate diminishment of power and control to the individual. And so we begin to lose our economic freedom, our educational freedom, our religious freedom, and then of course, the freedom of speech. Isn't every freedom dependent on the other? And shouldn't we fight to preserve each freedom and stop from ceding those freedoms to politicians and to the government?
Well, yes. And what bothers me, and has been bothering me for years, by the way, it's not something new. We have seen it. We have seen this phenomenon of this flirtation with socialism accelerate in the last few months and a couple of years in the United States, but it has been present for quite a while. In my view, it is based on ignorance. The average American, especially the young person who has attended high school and college with some of these left-wing professors, simply does not understand US history, world history, and much less economics. They have been taught to look at the faults of the United States. We have faults. There is no country in the world that is ruled by people that doesn't have faults, because people are not perfect beings. I like to say there's very few of us, but I say that jokingly. We are human beings. And the system, however, that the human beings of this country almost 250 years ago created has given more people more hope, more freedoms, more pursuit of happiness than any other system that has been created. Churchill had again, I mean, I'm going to bombard you with Churchill quotes, but he said, democracy is the worst system of government, with the exception of all the others. Right. Meaning everything is relative compared to what is happening today, for example, in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Uzbekistan, in Russia, in Belarus, in Vietnam, where you have some economic freedoms, but no political freedoms, or in China, where you have market Leninism, what people refer to as no longer Marxism, Leninism, because they have allowed a great deal of economic freedom, but they have cracked down on the political freedoms, is what you were referring to, Daniel. As the state gives the individual, as if the individual didn't deserve it. The individual, in our philosophy, derives his freedom from God, if he believes in God, not from the state. But when the state starts giving you something, the state is going to take away. I still lived in Cuba, for example, in 1959 and 60, when the state decided, Castro decided, that there was going to be a better distribution of food. Well, Cuba actually had one of the highest levels of income per capita, nutrition levels per capita, the lowest level of infant mortality per capita. Cuba was a very fast developing country based on individual initiative, on the free market. It was flawed. It had too many dictators. I consider Batista a dictator, and there had been others before Batista. But the system that Castro imposed not only did not give the poor people more food, it ended up taking food away from everybody else. The system doesn't work. And so as the as the communist government of Cuba used the ration card. They gave each citizen a ration card. They said, okay, we have X amount of food, which is also a very unmodern way of looking at things. So we're going to divide this food more evenly. Again, this is a country that had one of the highest levels of protein consumption in Latin America, the third highest level of meat consumption after Argentina and Uruguay, which were and still are two of the biggest cattle producers in the entire Latin America. The third one was Cuba. People don't realize these things. So there wasn't this famine. There were poor people in Cuba. They deserved to be helped, but not through the system that Fidel Castro imposed. Because what it did, again, quoting Winston Churchill, it ended up bringing everybody into misery. And because there was no incentive, the farmers stopped growing products as they have in Venezuela. And then you have these countries that are so rich. I have been to Nicaragua, the interior of Nicaragua. I've seen all of Venezuela. I've seen all of Cuba because my father loved to travel and would take us around the entire country. These are rich countries, but they're populated by very poor people who do not have enough to eat simply because of the economic and political system that has been imposed on them. And the problem with this system of socialism and communism, which are cousins, and I'm not talking about Scandinavian socialism, by the way, which is completely different, is that, as I said at the outset, as it fails, it cannot admit that it is failing because of its own flawed philosophy or implementation. It blames the people. It forces them to work harder. And what happens is the people have no incentives, so they don't work. And the government then starts to jail them because they see this as a refusal by the people to support the government instead of the other way around. And so it is a vicious circle. And this is where you have this enormous amount of repression. I mean, murders, assassinations, executions, torture, jailing. There are thousands and thousands of people in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua that have been executed by the government for crimes that in many cases they have invented. Orwell, read Animal Farm, read 1984. Those are books written actually about the totalitarian system, but the model was the Soviet Union. Sorry, I tend to go on a little too long, but it's because it is so frustrating to see citizens of the United States, the government that established a system that, with all its flaws, served the largest number of people in the best possible way, a country that has led the world in science and technology and health and medicines. Look at the Nobel Peace Prizes that were just handed out. The majority of them, of the whole world, were handed out to doctors who are either American or work in the United States. There were a couple of British, there were a couple of French or Europeans, but there were no Russians, there were no Chinese, there were no Cubans or Nicaraguans or Venezuelans, not because the size of their brain is any smaller, it's because they don't have the freedom that this country gives to people to create, to be creative.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that unleashes that innovation in the individual, and there's no incentive also either, right, for profit, which I think drives a lot of people. Let's be honest. Exactly. So one is not incentivized actually to innovate. What for? I'm not going to get anything out of it. I think that's part of the problem. Andres, I want to go back to you because you were also talking about, the ambassador was talking about the frustration that he has, where you see this throughout history has played out. And every time it fails, as Milton Friedman would say, every time socialism is tried, it has failed. And it's failed miserably. And yet, I listened to you and you're talking that you believed in socialism. Now, I went to school in Mexico until the 6th grade and school in the US. And some of the things, where they kind of kept the balance a little bit in Mexico, they would say, Emiliano Zapata, el general Emiliano Zapata, el general de la revolución, creía en lo que era tierra y libertad, land, property, private property, and freedom. And the Plan de Ayala spells out economic freedom. And then Benito Juárez would talk about el respeto al derecho ajeno es la paz. The sort of the phrases that they would talk about where you respect somebody else's property and somebody else's freedoms, and that we fight for those freedoms. But then, of course, I would also see sort of the socialist tendencies in Mexico, la usurpación del petróleo por parte del gobierno, all these things, nationalized electricity, the phone, the utilities. Yet, why is it that you were persuaded to believe in socialism? Didn't you see, as Ambassador Reich was talking about, the history of socialism and all its ravages that it caused in its wake?
No, actually, I didn't, Daniel, because when I was in high school, well, my high school education program was, of course, not the best in the world when it comes to universal history, but there was a huge component in national history, but of course, from a point of view that Simón Bolívar was the greatest man on earth, and we have to follow his lead. So it was actually, remember, it was more about Venezuela and the national history of Venezuela than universal history. And most of all our things, many of my professors at the time were Chavistas. So I was indoctrinated when I was in high school, by the high school by itself, by people in the community. I had mostly other things that surrounded me at the point. It was not until I left that atmosphere and I entered college that I started seeing other ideas. One of my best friends, who is still called like a brother today, he gave me one little book called The Morality of Capitalism, which is edited by Tom Palmer. When I read that, it was like, a window to the world, a window to the truth. I was like, what is happening? I mean, I started understanding that what Chavez was doing was no other thing than nationalist socialism, using the idea of nationalism, like Bolivar, all this process from eras from the independence, and combining that with the idea of socialism. So the thing that I also see a lot in the college students, and that's why I try to be empathetic with them, because I used to be in their shoes. It's like they see problems in the U.S. They see the huge debt that they have in the college debt. They see the problems with healthcare. They see the divided country. They see a lot of stuff. So by the experience they have, by the education that they had in high school and in college, they think that all those problems are because of the political system of America, that they hear everyone that it is, pure capitalism. And we all know that in the U.S., yes, it's the flag of capitalism in the world, but there is a lot of government intervention in this country. Main of the problems of healthcare, the problems of the drugs, or the drug prices, many of those problems come because there is too many involvement of the government in those issues and those industries. So, but they don't see that. They only see a problem, and they assume that if the problem is going on in the U.S. and the U.S. is like a capitalist system, then the capitalism is the problem. So we have to move forward the all completely opposite, and that's what they are being sold by most of the media. That's what they are being sold by professors. That's what they are being sold by many of the artists and many of the main political influencers. So they think that socialism is the way. So what I try to tell them is like, yes, all the problems that you see in the U.S. are real. But socialism is only going to further those problems into just a dimension that you cannot even imagine. So we start, having discussions like, okay, this problem, what do you think that's going on? Well, these are the solutions that we can go forward. And I put the example in Venezuela. So you think that's a problem here, for example, having socialist medicine. Well, in Venezuela, we had socialist medicine. And this is what happened. So I think that one of the things we have to be doing looking forward for the future is to trying to aim at these college students, and not only college students, high school students, with more empathy to understand what they're going through, more respect, because when you think in socialism, you cannot just go to an historian and say everyone who thinks socialist is just stupid and you put it against the wall, because you are just creating adversaries. You're just creating people that you are not actually understanding why they're thinking like that. So when you start entering in their feelings, in their minds, and you understand what they're going through, it's more easy to actually go through with ideas, because that's what happened with me. So as soon as I start seeing that, you start seeing results. Many of the students that I saw in the beginning of the year, they were Bernie supporters, and later they were just texting me like, hey, I did more research, and I think that Bernie's ideas are not the best ones. So, one at a time, you can start doing the job, but in order to do that, you have to put yourself in the shoes of those ones that you want to change.
Thank you, Andres. I actually, Kitty, I find it kind of encouraging that Andres actually learned about a better way, which was the free market system, in college. It just seems like it's the inverse in America, where kids are starting to get indoctrinated on socialism and socialist ideas, which is almost the opposite. Have we lost a generation in Nicaragua, for example, in the universities or in our educational system? Is there just too much indoctrination that we cannot overcome the ideas of socialism, or has there been an opening up now to the merits of the free market system? Because Andres is right. I see that when you argue or when you have discussions with a socialist or someone who believes in socialist ideas, they will attribute everything that is wrong with society to capitalism, and everything that is good, they'll attribute it to some kind of socialist program. And so that's their false arguments that they base these false premises on, when in fact, if we have any kind of productivity and wealth and prosperity in America, it's because of a free market system. And if there's opportunity, it's because of a free market system. But do you see that maybe we have lost a generation in Nicaragua?
In Nicaragua, it's kind of a unique situation, because when in the 80s, the indoctrination in the schools, it was 2 rifles plus 2 rifles equals 4 rifles. And rifles are used to kill Yankees, who are the enemies of humanities. And if you listen to that for 10 years, what can be expected from that generation? It was rough. That was in the 80s. Then we had a short period of democracy, and then we went back again to socialism. And what has been taught in the universities over the past 10, 15 years, Marx, Engels, I mean, they aren't taught anything else. Policemen go to the schools and tell them that Sandino is the greatest thing that has happened to Nicaragua. But what happened in 2018 in April, we had a civic rebellion, and it's been terrible for us here. Over 300 students were assassinated in the streets. And all of a sudden, that generation that we thought was lost suddenly woke up. They did. And even though what is taught in schools and universities is still the same, it's still the same indoctrination the Sandinistas have done over the past years, it doesn't mean that this generation hasn't finally understood that we do live under a socialist regime and that we need to change it. So I would say that there's hope for Nicaragua, but it hasn't been easy, and not everybody understands, and it's going to take time. And that's why we're hoping for free and fair elections next year, because it's the only way to really transform the country. We won't be able to under the dictator that we have. So can this generation be rescued? Yes, it can. I really do think it can. It's just terrible that such tragedy that happened in 2018 is what led this generation to wake up. It just has cost too many lives. So there's hope. Yes, there is.
I pray that there is. Ambassador, a lot of the young kids coming out of the universities today will tell you, well, look, I'm not talking about the failed socialist regimes that it just implemented the wrong policies or did it heavy-handed in Cuba, Venezuela, or anywhere else in Latin America, like Bolivia, or now even Colombia to a certain extent, and Argentina. I'm talking about the European socialist system, the democratic socialism in the Nordic countries is what they'll reference. Isn't democratic socialism sort of a happy medium because the people keep electoral control?
Well, one of the problems is that there's so many ways in which socialism or even democracy is misused, not only not only is it defined incorrectly, but it's misused. I mean, what about the German Democratic Republic? I mean, is that a democratic republic? That was East Germany, by the way. That was one of the most repressive governments that ever existed. It didn't end it with the fall of the Soviet Union. What about the People's Democratic Republic of Korea? Sounds good. It's North Korea. It's a country where, you know, the people get killed for picking up grains of corn that have fallen off of trains and eating them. They get shot. Those are communist societies. What I'm worried about is that people here do not understand the economics of the system that people like Bernie Sanders are pushing. Now, Bernie Sanders, you got to say something for him. He is a lot more honest than many of the other people in politics today in the United States who are socialists or just Marxists. Plain, you don't have to be a Marxist to be a socialist in the view of some of these people. But if you're a Marxist, and there are many, and by the way, for example, you know, one of the most popular movements around today, the Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter, calls itself, or the leaders call themselves, trained Marxists. If you go to their website, they tell you, for example, one of the things they want to do is break up the nuclear family that has been the building block of our society and every other successful society in history. But some of the economic programs that Bernie Sanders proposes would absolutely bankrupt this country. And yet they're very popular because, we're going to make, no more student loan debt. Everybody who has student loan, it's going to be paid for. You won't have to pay for it anymore. The government will pay for it. Education will be free. Healthcare will be free. Well, there's no such thing as a free lunch, as Milton Friedman said. Nothing is free. If you understand the most basic elements of economics, you understand that everything has a value. Everything has a trade-off. The money that Bernie Sanders would put, and we're talking about trillions of dollars for some of those programs as he's proposing. He hasn't said where the money's going to come from. Well, it's going to come from taxes. The government, no government has its own money. The money that goes into the coffers of any government come from the people. Right. And when the government starts spending money like crazy, the way that Bernie or others wanted to spend, then the people have to work harder, and they can only keep less and less of that money. So the people then, again, they become unhappy, they start to protest, and then the repression begins. And that could happen here if you had somebody like Bernie Sanders.
Isn't Bernie himself also promoting the Nordic countries as the model type of socialism?
Yes, and this is where he's being dishonest.
Right.
I give him credit for being honest, and this is where he's being dishonest, because he knows that that's not the kind of socialism he's been proposing. A man like Bernie Sanders, who went on his honeymoon to the Soviet Union in the 1970s, is not exactly a Scandinavian socialist. If he had been a Scandinavian socialist, he might have gone to Helsinki, or he might have gone to Stockholm or Oslo, very nice cities, which, by the way, many of those countries, they've turned away from socialism. And even when they had socialism, it was not the socialism on the other side of the Iron Curtain where Bernie went on his honeymoon, because obviously there was something very attractive there for him that he wanted to study and he wanted to see. I mean, you know, I can think of 2,000 places on earth where I would rather spend my honeymoon than in Moscow under the communists in the 1970s. But the socialist system of Scandinavia was always, and still is, first of all, it's democratic in that they change the system, and sometimes the socialist parties lose to free market parties. But it's always been democratic, not in the Marxist countries. In Scandinavia, the economy was still based on free enterprise, individual initiative, private property, all the things that disappear in the Cubas and Nicaraguans, the Venezuelas, and the other communist countries. You mentioned something, just to finish, since we both mentioned Milton Friedman. You know, Milton Friedman said, and I mean, it was intended to be humorous, but it's so true. He said, if you put socialists in charge of the Sahara Desert, very soon you will have a shortage of sand. If you look, well, I mean, look at Cuba. Cuba was one of the world's biggest producers of sugar. It now imports sugar. Venezuela sits on the largest reserves of oil in the world. It is having to import oil from Algeria and gasoline from Iran. Nicaragua, as Kitty said, Nicaragua was one of the, even under a dictatorship, and I consider Somoza a dictator, was one of the biggest producers of meat and agricultural products in Latin America. After a few years of the Ortega brothers and their idiotic Marxist policies, plus their corruption. By the way, we haven't talked about corruption yet, but every one of these governments is incredibly corrupt. But Nicaragua became one of the poorest countries in Central America, and it has to import food. So, again, there are very few redeeming social values to socialism. I agree with Churchill's definition. It just encourages the spreading of misery.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Andres, you've been now in America for a while, and you've been going to our university systems, and you see the youth movements across the country. And I think you saw a lot of the demonstrations that were going out on the streets, that were happening in the streets, and some of them very violent. Should the Marxist agenda we see being promoted by BLM and Antifa concern us? I mean, after all, they're fighting for equality, right? And I'm fully aware that they are pushing Marxism, the destruction of the nuclear family, anti-capitalism, and defund the police type of stuff. How dangerous is this?
Well, it's pretty dangerous, Daniel. I mean, when you see all of what you say, and they actually speak, they have spoken in many rallies about controlling the means of production, things about the actual Marxism. They speak about the struggle of class, and they even go further, not only class, but they start speaking of the struggles, the battle of races and stuff like that. So they are engaged in a more and more divided speech when in a country that is already divided. So of course it's really dangerous, because we have to remember what happened in Venezuela before Chavez. Venezuela, between the 80s and 90s, is starting the road to be a more divided country. When Chavez came to power, people didn't trust the bipartisan system anymore. They didn't trust the political system anymore. They didn't trust not only the parties, but the people that they were influencing, the means of communication. They didn't trust almost anyone. So Chavez came in as the outsider and said, well, I'm going to reunite this country. I'm going to be the humanist. He never said he was a socialist or a capitalist, just like Castro in his moment. And he just came in and completely destroyed the country eventually. And either the main problem here in the US is that, just like you say, a lot of people go to these events with the BLM because they want that equality. But behind that equality, there is a huge problem. But I started seeing, and we have seen many polls about that people, when they go to those events, the majority of people, even there are Democrats, the majority of people, they are only fighting to what, for example, happened to George Floyd. They want, to see what is going on in the criminal system, so to see how is the problem, educational problems with the officers. They want to, more civil rights protection and all of that. But behind all of that, you have the leaders of BLM who are praising all these rallies, and they want to advance those policies. So I think that eventually we will see a moment where this country will have to make a choice. We haven't seen right now, but we will see in the future more politicians, identifying themselves as activists of BLM, because these people from BLM, maybe some of them are going to start, chasing political offices, public offices, and they want, political power. So when that moment comes, we're starting seeing if all of those people who supported BLM, it was only for equality, or they actually support the Marxist agenda. I tend to believe that this country is not going to support a completely Marxist agenda. But let's see what happens in the future.
Great. Kitty, before I go to Israel Ortega, who has some questions online, both the ambassador and Andres were talking about this sort of seeping in of Marxist type personalities or people who embrace socialism and are now teaching it or promoting it in America. Is that how it started in Nicaragua? Was it gradual, or did it just happen overnight? Did you not see it coming? And here in America, it just seems like it has been metastasizing and growing and developing. You talked about Bernie Sanders, who fully embraces the socialist moniker, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Squad, these types of personalities who are very comfortable with that language. Is that what happened in Nicaragua, or did it happen overnight?
Actually, it almost happened overnight, and was a mistake that the generation of which I am part of, back in the 79, believed that the guerrilla movement, which was Marxist, would be a better option than Somoza, which was a dictator. And they just believed that a Marxist government could never end up taking over Nicaragua, and that the guerrilla would just liberate us from Somoza, and then everything would be fine overnight. And it happened completely the contrary. And that's the system they implanted, and it's been 41 years. And even though we had a brief respite of democracy, we keep making the same mistake over and over. And unfortunately, and we have to accept it, in 2006, we let Ortega come back to power. And we've always known he's socialist. So it's something that I think in Nicaragua, it's everyone's responsibility. We have made big mistakes, and we have to make sure that we don't make them again. And we have to tell our story so it doesn't happen anywhere else. Because different than in other countries where a socialist regime has arrived, taken over, and stayed there for years or decades, in Nicaragua, that has not been the case. So it's really sad to see what has happened in this country, which, like Ambassador Reich said, was very rich. And then all of a sudden, here we are, the second poorest country in America. So mistakes have been made. They can't be ever made again.
I want to go now to Israel. I want to bring you in because I know you have some questions from the folks that have been following us on Facebook. Are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. We're getting some great engagement on social media. And one of the questions that has come in, the person's asking, what is the proper role for the government then in caring for the truly dependent, the veterans, the children, the physically challenged, and the elderly?
So, Ambassador, if you want to take it.
Sure. I mean, a government in a free society, in a democratic society, plays a very important role. I have equated it to the cement, that keeps the bricks of a building together. You have to have something that unifies the structure. The government plays in the United States plays and has played a very important role, but it has always taken care not to overwhelm the creative power of the individual and of the private sector. Some governments have been more aggressive than others in our history in regulating the private sector. In some cases, the private sector needed to be regulated. Not all. Believe me, I work in the private sector, and it's a jungle out there, as people say. There's a lot of people who are not honest. So we have to have law enforcement in business, for example, to keep people from taking advantage of others, or from producing shoddy products, or from producing toxic products. So, I mean, there are many, many roles for government. You mentioned, taking care of veterans, and there are many people in our society who are incapable, physically or mentally incapable of taking care of themselves. I think it is a legitimate role of government to provide that, what we have called in this country a social safety net. A country this rich, this prosperous, and it's prosperous because of our freedom and our system of individual liberties and the free market. A country this prosperous should not allow anyone to go hungry, should not allow people to live in the streets as we now have in Los Angeles and Seattle and New York and many other cities. Hundreds of thousands of people living homeless. I believe that's a failure of government, frankly. It's also a failure of private enterprise, and it's a failure of the non-governmental organizations. It's a failure of our entire society. I'm not saying that people should be picked up off the streets and given, a brand new car and a big house. They should be given opportunities to lift themselves up. And that's the one thing that when people have referred to the United States throughout history, they referred to this as the nation, the country of opportunities, and we still are. And if you look at the patterns of migration in the world, this is still the country to which the largest number of migrants, immigrants, whatever you want to call them, want to come from all over the world, not just from Mexico or Central America or South America, but from as far away as Afghanistan and Syria and the African countries. Every single day, people cross oceans and rivers and risk their lives to come here. That does not, to me, sound like a failed system. It is a very successful system that constantly requires updating and maintenance, but that definitely is the most successful system, as I said earlier, that has provided the most freedoms and most opportunity for the largest part of the population in the history of the world.
Israel, you want to add something else?
Yeah. So the next question coming in. This one's coming in from Zoom. It may be a technical question, but somebody's asking, what's the difference between social democracy and democratic socialism?
I'll let somebody else handle it. I don't want to filibuster.
But yeah, I can answer that.
By all means, Andres. Yeah.
Okay. So well, when you speak about social democracy, usual people, right there tend to see what they should see. Some countries in Europe where you have a welfare state that protects protects the majority of liberties, allow private property, allow individual liberties, but you have higher taxes, you have a government that is trying to distribute wealth in some way, but not completely destroying growth in the other hand. So it's not like a perfect system, but it's completely better than the one of democratic socialism, because democratic socialism is just arriving to socialism through votes. That's what happened in Venezuela. That was happening in many countries. When you see a leader that through the democratic means arrives to power and then start to enacting and implementing socialism, which is different, from the usual Marxist view that we saw in many communist parties, like, for example, in Venezuela in the 60s, that the governing party didn't believe in democracy, so they wanted to reach power through, violence and all these means. They refined that view, and they understood that they had to reach power through the democratic means and then destroy democracy, like Chavez did in Venezuela, where he completely destroyed the separation of powers. In a social democracy, you have separation of powers. When you have the separation of powers, when you actually respect private property, when you actually respect individual liberties, that's an actual system that can work. It's working in Europe in some ways. It's not perfect, of course, and it's not complete to capitalism. That's what we achieve. But you need to have a mix of both. You have to, like Ambassador also said, to have a mix of the responsibility of government and also that role that has the markets. We as well, I consider myself a libertarian, we think that more markets should be responsible of many other problems in the society, but you also have the role of government, just like Ambassador was saying with the homeless. That's a failure of the complete society. And that is something that where you see the example that you need the role of both powers in the society, the government and the market. That doesn't happen in democratic socialism, but you can see that in some social democracies, like in Europe and in the Scandinavian countries.
Israel, if I could also say to that I think it's so important to underscore what's being said here, is that of course the free market system is not a perfect system, and sometimes I think even governments or even culture sometimes will actually create impediments to the market. That actually, sometimes the problem is little access to the marketplace, in the sense that there are barriers. For example, Latinos, 30% of us only speak Spanish. The fact that 30% of us don't speak English is a major barrier in America. The fact that 33% of us don't have a high school diploma, adults, is a major barrier to positioning yourself better in the marketplace to take full advantage of the system. So a lot of us fight for, we talked about redistribution, but I'd like to see a redistribution of knowledge and equal opportunity, not a redistribution of somebody else's earned wealth. And what I mean by that is, like, we should get into the business of trying to remove those barriers, help a brother out, extend a hand. We can't help everyone, but everyone can help someone. That whole saying. Yeah. It's just so important that we be that social democracy, and that we stand together to borrow a title, so that all can rise by actually increasing access to the marketplace, and then developing the skills and the talent of that individual, so that then he can leverage those skills for profit, for gain, for wealth, to generate wealth not only for themselves, but wealth for others. I think it's so important. And so, but sometimes I think we get lost in the haze of, and I'll go to you, Kitty, that we look for equality. Equality is like everything for some people. But the problem with equality is that sometimes that leads to equality of misery, because you have to bring somebody down in order to gain equality. And people have different ambitions. People have different dreams, and they want a different lifestyle maybe. And they don't want the kind of lifestyle that you want. They want to achieve their own dream, not the dreams of a politician. And so in Nicaragua, how can America help, and in Venezuela even, Andres, or throughout Latin America, Ambassador, how can we help in spreading the merits of the free market system, individualism, a limited government, without being called interlopers or imperialists, or like Andres was talking about the Yankees that would come in and with their presumption that they could control everything. How do we balance that?
I think we have to help countries strengthen democracy. That's the main point. And then education. It's through education in a democratic society that we're going to be able to achieve those goals. Because what happens here is that, for example, we did have at a given time the agricultural reform where land was given away. And what happened eventually? They sold the land because they couldn't sustain it, they couldn't produce. And it just ends up being a vicious circle. And then you have a lot of organizations that do help the most vulnerable sectors of society here in Nicaragua. But is that what we really need? And is that what we really want? We need democracy strengthened in a country so we can have a free market, so we can have private property, so we have people that can go and get a good education, and we can turn the tide around, because we can't continue. And looking at from a United States point of view, giving handouts to just cover the needs of those vulnerable sectors. We have to strengthen democracy, we have to teach them, and we have to make sure that education has a major role in the future of every country. If not, this is going to go on and on and on. That's what I think that we really have to focus on, to ensuring that democratic societies can really be sustainable and that we won't have this circle repeating itself over time.
Ambassador, the Interdevelopment Bank, the World Bank, the UN, all these institutions that exist to lift other nations up in Latin America, are they not working? And what can we do better to spread democracy and the merits of the free market system within these countries?
Well, among the various jobs that I've had in the last 40 years, I was the assistant administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development for Latin America and the Caribbean. And it was therefore my job to try to answer these questions that you've been asking and Kitty's been trying to answer, and all of us. What does the United States do to help Latin America? First of all, we have to recognize that no country, even the United States, as rich as we are, can possibly solve every problem of a continent of 750 million people. It's enormous. We have to follow, old cliches like, we shouldn't hand somebody a fish, but teach them how to fish. It's an old biblical term. But so you can't believe how many people have come to me, especially when I've had that job and others, and said, well, Latin America needs is a Marshall Plan. So what I did once, many years ago, I went back and figured out how much money we had spent in the Marshall Plan, the original Marshall Plan in Europe after the war, which helped to rebuild Europe. And I calculated how much money the United States government, without even counting the private money that has gone to Latin America, which is many times that of the government, we have spent 3 times the Marshall Plan amount in Latin America in the last 70 years. And yet, there are enormous tracts of Latin America where people live on $2 a day, $3 a day. That's the bad sign. The good sign is that there are many countries that have made enormous progress in those same, say, 50, 60 years, based on the proper economic policies. I remember I was on a television show. There was a left-wing Mexican senator. Maybe that's redundant, but she said, United States, you need to help us more. We're a poor country. And I told her the truth. I said, no, Madam Senator, Mexico is not a poor country. I've traveled the entire length of Mexico and I've studied Mexico. And Mexico is a rich country. In fact, there's not a poor country in Latin America. They are rich countries populated by poor people because, frankly, their politicians, their leaders have followed the wrong policies, or they've stolen the money of the people. She didn't seem to like that answer for some reason. I don't understand, but I'm kidding. I mean, take a country like Argentina. Argentina at the beginning of the last century had the 5th highest per capita income in the world, not just the Americas, in the world. And what happens? A few years later, you have these supranationals, these populists coming in, and people like Perón, dictators who steal the money. And you have Argentina that since then has gone through all of these upheavals. And once again, now they're having to go to the International Monetary Fund to borrow $65 billion, a country that in World War II and before World War II was called the granary of Europe, because they provided so much wheat to Europe that Europe practically lived off of Argentine bread, bread made from Argentine wheat. And I can give you examples like that from all over Latin America. The answer to Latin America's development is inside Latin America, but they seem to be making the same mistakes all over again. Look at what happened in Bolivia this week. I mean, a year ago, they got rid of Evo Morales, a man who was completely anti-modern, who was a socialist, who was an ally of the Castros and of Chavez, and who claimed that he was for the indigenous population, but a man who, concurrent with his presidency of Bolivia, was the head of the Coca Growers Union of Bolivia. And he kept that job. And he turned Bolivia into, I mean, Bolivia already had that problem of narcotics problem, of trafficking, but he increased it. And so he gets thrown out of office because he cheated in the election, and people after 15 years of that kind of government finally give up, and he leaves the country. And a year later, his party gets reelected. They just won on Sunday. Now, do you think Bolivia is going to make progress in the next few years with that kind of leadership? No, of course not. The first thing that the new president-elect said he was going to do is restore relations with Cuba and Venezuela. You want to tell me what Cuba and Venezuela are going to do for Bolivia's development when they cannot feed their own people? I mean, it is very frustrating. I mean, you're hearing the frustration of someone.
I understand it.
You know, who has had these jobs. I studied economic development. I got a master's in Latin American economic development at Georgetown University because I had spent years in Latin America before that. And I said, there's got to be a way for this continent to make progress. And, you know, one can get very frustrated, if not downright cynical, about the inability of the people to learn the right lessons and of the leaders to be unselfish. There's a lot of selfish leaders who are interested in their own self-enrichment, and they don't really care about the population. Most of the ones that you hear calling, you know, saying that they're speaking for the people and that they're protecting the people, those are the ones you better keep your hand on your wallet, because, you know, it's in danger.
So Andres, I'll go to you now. As we start to wrap up here, we know that for a society to thrive, to be prosperous, you know, a government has to set the table for its people to generate opportunity. And a lot has to do fundamentally with the kind of incentives that are actually unleashed, right? Is there incentive for productivity, for the people to generate products and services that meet market demand, then of course are rewarded with the consumers who buy their products and services, right? And so the role of government is very important in that. So there is a need for government. What organizations exist that are educating and informing whole societies in Latin America from the US, like Cato or other organizations that you know? Because I think pretty soon we need to have a thriving movement of libertarians and people who believe in the free markets, because we're going to need them over here in America pretty soon.
Absolutely. And you know, when I actually, when I arrived to the US, I came as an intern for the Cato Institute. So I know pretty well the work they're doing in Latin America. They have the University of del Cato. So they go to many places in Latin America, and they make these events, and they invite a lot of people. So you have what Cato is doing. You have what the institute that I'm working with, the Fund for American Studies. They have a program in Chile, which is the program for Latin America, where they bring a lot of students from the continent. They teach them about economics and politics and individual liberties and all of that. Just a few months ago, when all this pandemic was doing, and I had to change to make presentations online, I did over 15 presentations to groups in Latin America online, along with my partner Jorge Galicia, which is also part of the project with the Fund for American Studies. And that's also one of the things that these kind of organizations are doing. Another thing is Students for Liberty, which is a major organization of the students from college and universities all across the world. I was part of that organization when I was in Venezuela, and I know all the work they're doing to increase, you know, the amount of students in all these universities in Latin America, not only universities, but also high school students that want to, you know, reach out to what is going on in the rest of the world. And I think those are small steps, but there are needed steps. That you need students at one at a time, more and more and more, to actually start engaging in more of these ideas, because those students, they are going to be the doctors of the future. They're going to be the politicians, the engineers, are going to enter society, and they're not going to vote for a socialist. So I think that all the problems that Latin America are facing, they are going to be generational solutions. They're going to need generational solutions. We have to teach the next generations about what actually is the progress. And it has to be a different teaching than what is going on in Europe and the US, because just as you have said before, Latin America is a unique continent. We need problems, but common solutions that have worked in many other places in the world. So you have to understand each of the struggles in every single one of these countries. Find out why those liberty-minded politicians are not reaching power. What are they doing wrong? And once we start doing that, and more people start reaching to powers of influence, we can actually have politicians, just like Ambassador was saying, that they not steal from your pocket, that they're going to steal the money that are being handed out by other governments, and they actually start, facing against all these ideas from power. Because when you don't have the power, well, it's a really uphill battle.
No, absolutely. And look, I think it's just so important to underscore what you're saying in actually having a generation of young leaders and elected leadership who can make the case in those countries. Because, one thing is for America or Americans to come in and tell, folks that this is the best way to go about, generating productivity and the right incentives. Another thing is to have well-versed, eloquent individuals in those countries that folks can relate to, who can make the case for the free market system. Because the ambassador and I think we can talk to her, we're red in the face, but sometimes I hear some of these young kids, has so much talent, coming from Colombia, Venezuela, Chile, who are just amazing. And God, I would love to multiply those kids, right? And just create a vanguard for freedom in Latin America by Latin Americans. I think would be the most effective way to do that. We're going to start drawing down now. I think we have one more question. I'm going to go back to Israel for the last time. Israel?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. One question that came in from Heather, I'm just going to read it because I think it's a good one. She writes, for decades, it seems socialist-leaning ideologies have been steadily seeping into public education. Now we have a generation who sees government as a chief actor in solving all societal deficiencies and challenge. How do we undo this default understanding within the Gen X and beyond? And how can we expose this bias in the K-12 education sector for the next generation of Americans? Maybe for Kitty, who lived in the U.S. and obviously living in Nicaragua, but obviously open to everyone on the panel as well.
Why don't we go ahead and have Kitty respond first, and then the ambassador, and then Andres, and then and those will be the closing statements. And anything else you want to add to that answer, so we can begin to conclude the panel discussion.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's a combination, and I think the media has a lot to do with it. I really think that aside from how socialism or whatever is seeping into the educational system in the United States, it's not just there. You have social media that you have to work with as well, and the media that use the channels, TV, everything. I mean, nothing is as it used to be anymore. So there's so much fake information, manipulation, that children are not getting clear what they really need to receive. Education is not as it was anymore. And again, it's all about families not being able to spend quality time with their children because they have to go out and work. So families used to be, and I hope they will continue to be, the cornerstone of society. And that's what's really at risk. And I think that's what's damaging or hurting education and how our children grow up. So that would be my opinion or my response to that question. But I would really like to take the opportunity just to wrap up my participation on the subject of free and fair elections. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because once you have a socialist dictator, you never have on their agenda free and fair elections. And precisely today, the OAS voted on demanding Ortega for the electoral reform we need to have free and fair elections. And it was sad to see that we had 20 votes in favor, 12 abstentions, and 2 against. in Latin America or in America, because this is the OAS, we should have had more votes in favor of that resolution. But again, we have to thank those 20 countries that are standing behind us. And I know the US elections are coming up in a couple of weeks. And I just want to say that you're lucky you still have free and fair elections. We don't. And I would just recommend that you use your vote wisely, because at least you can vote and you know your vote is going to be counted. We don't even know if we're going to have elections and if we'll have that opportunity. So thank you very much.
You bet, Kitty. No, and I really appreciate you emphasizing that the families are the keystone of society. I believe that 100%. Ambassador?
Well, I guess just to conclude, I agree that education is critical. Unfortunately, we haven't paid, those of us who believe that individual freedoms are at the basis of every successful society. And if you look around the world, you can see the examples. We have not paid enough attention to what's been happening in our high schools and colleges. They have been dominated by people who frankly don't believe in the free market system. And so they're promoting an ideology that is a failure, and they are ignoring, whether they're ignoring it on purpose, in other words, that they know that it exists, or whether they don't know that it exists, it's always, that ideology is always accompanied by political repression. This is not just an economic question, and it's not an economic decision whether we're going to have a socialist system and keep our freedoms. That is not possible. We lose the economic freedoms, we're going to lose the political freedoms as well.
Thank you, Ambassador. Andres?
Well, to wrap up, I think that what we're seeing here in the US, I think that the biggest problem is how divided the country is. And I want to emphasize in how to stop that division. You know, when I was in inter college, if it wasn't for this friend that gave me this book, you know, because it wasn't college overall, it was the human relations that I had with many people in college that actually took me out of that perspective that I have of socialism and actually brought me to the ideas of liberty. If it wasn't for that, maybe it would have took me longer to reach to those ideas. Maybe I never did. Who knows what would have happened? So I think that one of the biggest problems that we have in the US right now is that division among people, that they forget that in the end, we're all human beings. And here in America, they all are Americans. And after the elections, they are going to still be Americans. So I think that, you know, like late Justice, Supreme Justice Scalia used to say about late Supreme Justice Ginsburg, that, you know, she was her best friend. And they were diametral opposite in the way they were, you know, see the country and many things. But always Justice Scalia used to say that he always attack ideas, not people, only ideas. And we have to focus on that, because the more we have relations with other humans, with other people, and we empathize, the more easy it is to actually brought them out of that way of thinking, of that ignorance about socialism, the way that we approach the students, the way we approach small kids, the way we approach high school students, the way we approach everyone. If we start seeing ourselves not as adversary, you know, like you're blue and then I'm red and there is no common ground at all, the more common ground we find, the more unity there is, the more people are going to choose liberty. Well, because when you have more division, usually people is going to go for the same thing, and socialism is division. So I think that's what I trying to preach here in the US, you know, that people have to find common ground. And by finding common ground, they're going to understand that liberty is the main link that unites people.
Thank you, Andres. You know, before I close, I just want to remind folks, you know, that our founding fathers, when they did so eloquently said, you know, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that's the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In a very real way, that was them telling each and every one of us, look, I don't know what does it for you. You have to figure it out. And in America, that bold experiment of trusting in the individual, of trusting in the people to form societies, to generate opportunities for themselves and generate wealth for themselves and pass it on to others, has made America into the most prosperous, monstrous economic giant in the history of the world. There has never been the kind of wealth that has been created as there is in America. You know, it's fascinating. Los Angeles County, its economy is bigger than all of Mexico. New Jersey's economy is equivalent to Russia's. Texas is equivalent to France. That's how powerful we are when it comes to economics. And it boggles the mind to think that people take that kind of prosperity for granted. And which is why I really appreciate us having this kind of conversation, an honest conversation. I want to thank Kitty Monterrey for being with us. Thank you, and I pray for you and that you endure a lot of what is happening in Nicaragua, and that the fortunes of the Nicaraguan people turn quickly. And Ambassador, I've always admired your work, and your trayectoria has been just so impressive. And I'm just thrilled that there are folks like yourself, who represent us as Latinos in places of power, in the halls of government, and then that you do, right by us and right by America to strengthen our country and really defend the kind of system that makes it possible for us to accommodate for flows and flows of poor immigrants who come to America and create wealth for themselves and then wealth for others. That is the kind of system that we have, where people who could not achieve in their country of origin achieve their dream here, and it just must be defended. And Andres, the work you're doing, I'm just amazed by it. I admire your work, and thank you so much, for being a part of the conversation. I hope everybody who is listening has been enriched by this, that we've added value a little bit and maybe expanded some horizons. Please continue to stay connected. We are going to have more of these discussions as we move forward, and it'll be both on Zoom, on Facebook, throughout our social media platforms. Again, it's just important conversations to have. If you ever want to interact with us, we invite you to do so.